The pre-dawn darkness of September 26, 1918, was shattered by the most tremendous artillery barrage in American military history. Captain William Harrison of the 77th Division pressed his face against the muddy parapet of his trench, feeling the earth shake beneath him as 2,700 guns unleashed their fury upon German positions. The horizon blazed with muzzle flashes, transforming the Argonne forest into a hellish landscape of fire and smoke. "Jesus Christ," whispered Sergeant O'Malley beside him, his Irish accent thick with awe and terror. "It's like the world's ending." Harrison checked his pocket watch -0- for -30 hours. In 1 hour, over 1 million American soldiers would go over the top in what General John Pershing had promised would be the final offensive of the Great War. The Meuse-Argonne sector stretched 47 miles across the Western Front, from the Meuse River to the Argonne Forest, and it represented America's greatest gamble in the war. The artillery preparation had begun 3 hours earlier, targeting German trenches, machine gun nests, and artillery positions that had been meticulously fortified over for years of warfare. The Germans called this section of their line the Hindenburg Line, a seemingly impregnable fortress of concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and interlocking fields of fire that stretched deep into the Argonne's dense woodland. Lieutenant Colonel George Patton, commanding the 304th Tank Brigade, crouched beside his Renault tanks in the assembly area. The young cavalry officer had adapted quickly to mechanized warfare, understanding that these steel beasts represented the future of combat. His tanks were positioned to support the infantry advance through the forest's treacherous terrain, though he harbored serious doubts about their effectiveness in such dense woodland. "Gentlemen," Patton addressed his tank commanders through the thunderous barrage, "today we write history with steel and courage. The Boche have held this ground for years, but they've never faced American determination backed by American industry." The weight of expectation pressed upon every soldier in the sector. President Woodrow Wilson had personally endorsed this offensive as America's decisive contribution to ending the war. The American Expeditionary Forces had spent months planning this assault, studying German defensive positions through aerial reconnaissance and prisoner interrogations. According to documents captured from the German Second Army, as reported in contemporary military intelligence briefings, the enemy had positioned 5 divisions along the front, with extensive reserve forces held in readiness behind their lines. Private Thomas Anderson of the 28th Division huddled in his jumping-off trench, trying to steady his hands as he checked his rifle for the 100th time. At 19 years old, the farm boy from Pennsylvania had never imagined he would find himself preparing to assault one of the most heavily fortified positions on Earth. Round him, thousands of other young Americans made their final preparations, sharpening bayonets, writing last letters home, or simply staring into the darkness with the 1,000-yard stare of men contemplating their mortality. The German defenders were no less aware of what dawn would bring. Major Friedrich von Lossberg, commanding the German defensive sector, had spent weeks preparing his men for the expected American assault. His machine gun positions were perfectly sighted to cover every approach through the forest, while his artillery had pre-registered coordinates for devastating counter-battery fire. The German forces included battle-hardened veterans from both the Eastern and Western fronts, men who had survived for years of industrialized slaughter. As the artillery barrage reached its crescendo, Captain Harrison gathered his company around him in the pre-dawn gloom. These men, factory workers from Detroit, farmers from Iowa, shopkeepers from small New England towns, had been transformed into soldiers through months of training. Now they would face their ultimate test in the tangled hell of the Argonne forest, where American determination would clash with German desperation, in what would become the bloodiest battle in United States military history. At 0530 hours on September 26, 1918, the American artillery barrage lifted, and the whistle blasts echoed across the Meuse-Argonne sector. Captain Harrison's voice cut through the sudden relative quiet. "Up and at them, boys. For America and democracy." 1 million American soldiers rose from their trenches and began their advance across no man's land. The 77th Division, including Harrison's company, moved forward through the southern edge of the Argonne forest, where the trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated the canopy even at noon. The forest floor was a nightmare of shell holes, fallen logs, and tangled undergrowth that channeled the advancing Americans into predictable killing zones. Private Anderson stumbled forward with his squad, his rifle held at port arms as they navigated through the smoke and debris of the artillery bombardment. The initial advance met surprisingly light resistance. Many German forward positions had been abandoned during the barrage, but Anderson's experienced sergeant, a veteran of Below named Murphy, knew better than to trust this apparent success. "Keep your eyes open, boys," Murphy growled. "Fritz is playing possum. He's letting us get deep into his web before he springs the trap." Murphy's prediction proved tragically accurate. As the Americans pushed deeper into the forest, German machine gunners emerged from their concrete bunkers and began methodically cutting down the advancing infantry. The distinctive sound of German Maxim machine guns, a rapid, cloth-tearing noise, filled the forest as interlocking fields of fire caught the Americans in deadly crossfires. Lieutenant Colonel Patton's tanks, meanwhile, struggled through the forest terrain. The heavy Renault tanks, designed for more open ground, became bogged down in shell holes and fallen timber. German infantry, armed with new anti-tank rifles and concentrated small arms fire, picked off tank crews who exposed themselves trying to clear obstacles. Patton himself was wounded in the thigh by machine gun fire while attempting to guide his tanks forward on foot, but he refused evacuation and continued directing his armored units. From a shell crater, the German defense was orchestrated with typical Teutonic precision. Major von Lossberg had positioned his machine gun nests in reinforced concrete bunkers that had been camouflaged to blend perfectly with the forest environment. These positions, connected by deep communication trenches, allowed German forces to maintain coordinated fire even when individual strongpoints were bypassed by American infantry. Captain Harrison's company suffered its first major casualties when they encountered a concealed German strongpoint designated Strongpoint Eagle. In American intelligence reports, the position consisted of 3 reinforced bunkers positioned in a triangle, each containing heavy machine guns and connected by underground tunnels. When Harrison's men approached what appeared to be abandoned German trenches, the strongpoint erupted in a torrent of machine gun fire. "Get down! Take cover!" Harrison shouted, but his words were lost in the cacophony of gunfire. Within minutes, half his company was killed or wounded. Sergeant O'Malley, who had survived the Somme while serving with British forces before America entered the war, organized the survivors into small groups and began a methodical assault on the German position using fire and movement tactics learned through bitter experience. The fighting in the Argonne forest quickly devolved into a series of small unit actions as American companies and platoons became separated in the dense woodland. Communication between units broke down almost immediately as telephone lines were cut by artillery fire and radio equipment proved unreliable. In the forest environment, many American units found themselves fighting isolated battles against German strongpoints with no knowledge of the larger tactical situation. Private Anderson's squad became separated from their company during the initial assault and spent the day fighting a running battle through the forest. They discovered that the Germans had prepared multiple defensive lines, each one falling back to the next when pressure became too intense. The forest itself seemed to be the enemy. Visibility was limited to a few yards in any direction, making coordination impossible and turning every advance into a deadly game of blind man's bluff. By nightfall on September 26th, American forces had penetrated several miles into German positions, but at a horrific cost. Casualty reports, when they could be compiled at all, showed thousands of American soldiers killed, wounded, or missing in action. The initial optimism of the morning had given way to the grim realization that the Argonne forest would not be taken quickly or cheaply. The second day of the Meuse-Argonne offensive dawned gray and misty, with the acrid smell of credite and death hanging heavy over the Argonne forest. Captain Harrison, now commanding what remained of 2 companies after losing most of his officers, crouched in a shell crater that served as his temporary command post. His forces had advanced barely 2 miles in 24 hours of continuous fighting, and German resistance was stiffening with each passing hour. "Sir, we've lost contact with 2nd Battalion entirely," reported Corporal Jenkins, one of the few remaining radio operators in the sector. Last transmission indicated they were pinned down near Hill 244. But that was 6 hours ago. Harrison studied his mud-stained map, trying to make sense of the tactical situation. The dense forest had fragmented the American offensive into dozens of isolated battles, each fought by small groups of soldiers who had no clear picture of the larger situation. German defenders, intimately familiar with the terrain after 4 years of fortification, used the forest's natural obstacles to channel American attacks into carefully prepared killing zones. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Patton had managed to get several of his tanks moving again, despite his wound. The young officer had improvised new tactics for forest fighting, using his tanks as mobile strongpoints to support infantry assaults on German bunkers. However, the cost was enormous. Tank after tank fell victim to German anti-tank weapons, concealed artillery pieces, and infantry armed with explosive charges. Private Anderson had spent 36 hours in continuous combat, moving from one German position to another in a nightmarish progression through the forest. His original squad of 12 men was now reduced to 4, and he had witnessed horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Germans had constructed an elaborate network of bunkers, trenches, and strong points that seemed to appear magically from the forest floor whenever American forces approached. The German defense was masterfully coordinated despite the apparent chaos. Major von Lossberg had divided his sector into interlocking defensive zones, each capable of independent operation but mutually supporting. When American forces captured one position, they found themselves under fire from previously unseen strongpoints that commanded the captured ground. As documented in post-war German military records, this defense-in-depth strategy was specifically designed to maximize American casualties while preserving German fighting strength for counterattacks. On the morning of September 28th, Harrison's composite force encountered one of the most formidable German positions in their sector, a complex of bunkers built around a natural rock formation that dominated a crucial forest path. The position, designated Fortress Rock by American intelligence, contained multiple heavy machine guns, mortars, and a concealed 77mm field gun that could fire directly down the forest. The assault on Fortress Rock became a microcosm of the entire Argonne offensive. American infantry, supported by Patton's remaining tanks, launched repeated attacks against the German strongpoint, only to be driven back with heavy casualties. The position's defenders, elements of the German 4th Division, fought with the desperate courage of men who knew they were vastly outnumbered, but held superior positions. Sergeant O'Malley, now acting as Harrison's second-in-command, organized a flanking attack through seemingly impenetrable undergrowth to the north of the German position. Leading a squad of volunteers, including Private Anderson, O'Malley spent 6 hours crawling through thorny bushes and fallen timber to reach an advantageous position. Their attack, launched at dawn, caught the German defenders by surprise and allowed Harrison's main force to overrun the position after 8 hours of fighting. The cost of taking Fortress Rock illustrated the brutal mathematics of the Argonne campaign. Harrison's force of nearly 200 men was reduced to fewer than 60 effective soldiers, while German casualties were estimated at 30 killed and wounded. The arithmetic of attrition favored the defenders, who could fall back to prepared positions while the Americans had to advance across increasingly difficult terrain under constant fire. As September drew to a close, American forces had advanced approximately 10 miles into German-held territory, but progress was slowing dramatically. The forest seemed to swallow entire battalions, while German resistance was becoming more sophisticated and deadly. Supply lines stretched thin through the devastated landscape, making it increasingly difficult to provide ammunition, food, and medical supplies to forward units. The psychological toll on American soldiers was becoming as significant as the physical. Casualties. Men who had entered the forest with high morale and confidence in quick victory now moved like ghosts through the endless trees, their eyes hollow with exhaustion and trauma. The Argonne forest had become a charnel house where American determination was being tested against German desperation in a battle that showed no sign of ending. October 1st, 1918, brought no relief to the American forces grinding their way through the Argonne forest. Captain Harrison, his uniform torn and mud-stained, had been fighting continuously for 6 days with minimal sleep and irregular meals. His composite force, now consisting of survivors from 4 different companies, had become a brotherhood forged by shared suffering and mutual dependence. The tactical situation had evolved into a deadly pattern. American forces would assault a German strongpoint at enormous cost, only to discover that its capture merely exposed them to fire from the next line of defense. The Germans had created a defensive system so comprehensive that every piece of ground was covered by interlocking fields of fire, making any advance a costly endeavor. It was on this day that Sergeant Alvin York of the 82nd Division would perform the actions that would make him America's most famous hero of the Great War. York, a conscientious objector from Tennessee who had overcome his religious doubts about warfare, was serving as an acting corporal when his patrol encountered a German machine gun nest in a valley northeast of the Argonne forest proper. York's patrol, consisting of 17 men, was attempting to outflank a German position when they were caught in crossfire from multiple machine gun nests. Within minutes, 9 Americans were killed or wounded, leaving York and 7 others pinned down in whatever cover they could find. The German position consisted of 35 machine gunners and riflemen, who had the Americans completely at their mercy. What happened next became the stuff of legend. York, drawing upon his skills as a marksman honed through years of hunting in the Tennessee mountains, began systematically picking off German soldiers with his Springfield rifle. When German soldiers charged his position with bayonets, York switched to his pistol and killed several more. According to his own account, confirmed by surviving members of his patrol, York killed 25 German soldiers and forced the surrender of 132 others, including several officers. Meanwhile, Private Anderson's odyssey through the forest continued with a different kind of heroism, the quiet courage of ordinary soldiers, performing extraordinary acts under impossible conditions. His squad had been tasked with carrying wounded comrades back to aid stations through terrain that was constantly under German artillery fire. Anderson had made 7 trips through the killing zone, each time carrying or helping a wounded soldier to safety. The medical situation in the Argonne had become catastrophic. Field hospitals, located in hastily constructed facilities behind the lines, were overwhelmed with casualties. Army doctors, many of whom had never seen combat wounds before the war, worked without rest to save lives under conditions that would have been challenging in peacetime hospitals. As reported in contemporary American Red Cross documents, the Argonne campaign produced more battlefield casualties than American medical services had ever attempted to treat. Lieutenant Colonel Patton, still refusing evacuation despite his wound, had become a legend among the tank crews and infantry he supported. His insistence on leading from the front and his ability to inspire men under the most difficult circumstances had made him a symbol of American determination. However, the cost of his aggressive tactics was becoming evident. His tank brigade had lost over 60% of its vehicles and crews. Captain Harrison found himself facing an impossible tactical problem on October 3rd. His reduced force had been ordered to capture a German strongpoint designated Devil's Den, a complex of reinforced bunkers built into a natural ravine that commanded the only passable road through his sector. Previous attacks by other American units had failed with heavy casualties, but the position had to be taken if the offensive was to continue. The assault on Devil's Den required every lesson Harrison had learned about forest warfare. He divided his force into 3 groups, one to provide covering fire, one to attack from the front as a diversion, and a third to infiltrate the German position from an unexpected direction. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution by exhausted soldiers, operating on their last reserves of strength and courage. Private Anderson volunteered for the infiltration team. Despite having already done more than his share of dangerous missions, The team spent 12 hours moving through supposedly impassable terrain to reach their attack position, crawling through thorny undergrowth and wading through swampy ground that had been created by shell craters and autumn rains. The final assault on Devil's Den began at dawn on October 4th. Harrison's diversionary attack drew German fire while Anderson's infiltration team worked their way into the rear of the position. The battle lasted for hours and resulted in the destruction of the German strongpoint, but at a cost that illustrated the terrible arithmetic of the Argonne campaign. Harrison's force of 60 men was reduced to 28 effective soldiers, while German casualties numbered approximately 15. As October progressed, it became clear that the Meuse-Argonne offensive had become a battle of attrition on a scale never before seen in American military history. The forest continued to claim victims with mechanical regularity, while German resistance showed no signs of weakening. Yet American forces continued to advance, yard by bloody yard, driven by a determination that would ultimately prove decisive in ending the Great War. By October 15, 1918, the Meuse-Argonne offensive had consumed American forces for 3 weeks of continuous combat. Captain Harrison, now commanding a battalion after the loss of so many field-grade officers, had witnessed the transformation of the American Expeditionary Force from an enthusiastic but inexperienced army into a hardened fighting force tempered by the brutal realities of industrial warfare. The tactical situation had evolved significantly since the opening days of the offensive. American forces had adapted to forest warfare, developing new techniques for small unit operations and learning to coordinate infantry, artillery, and the surviving tanks in ways that their pre-war training had never envisioned. However, these adaptations came at an enormous cost in human lives and material. Private Anderson, now a corporal after battlefield promotions following the deaths of his superiors, had become one of the most experienced forest fighters in his unit. He had survived encounters that had killed or wounded hundreds of his comrades, developing an almost supernatural ability to sense German positions and anticipate enemy tactics. Yet even Anderson was approaching the limits of human endurance. After 3 weeks of continuous combat, the German defense had also evolved during the campaign. Major von Lossberg had been wounded and evacuated, but his replacement, Colonel Heinrich von Stulpnagel, had continued the methodical defense that was bleeding American forces white. The German strategy had shifted from holding every position to the last man to a more flexible defense in depth that maximized American casualties, while preserving German fighting strength for counterattacks. Lieutenant Colonel Patton, finally forced to accept medical evacuation for his infected wound, had been replaced by Major Henry Serrano, a regular Army officer who lacked Patton's flair for leadership, but possessed a thorough understanding of tank warfare. Under Serrano's command, the remaining American tanks had been organized into small groups that provided direct support to infantry assaults on German strongpoints. The most significant development in mid-October was the emergence of what became known as the Lost Battalion Incident. Major Charles Whittlesey of the 308th Regiment had advanced too far ahead of supporting units and found his battalion surrounded by German forces in a pocket of the Argonne forest. For 5 days, October 2nd through 7th, Whittlesey's men held their position against overwhelming odds while suffering enormous casualties from German artillery and infantry attacks. Captain Harrison had been part of the relief force that attempted to reach the Lost Battalion. The operation required American forces to attack through some of the most heavily defended terrain in the entire sector, against German positions that had been reinforced specifically to prevent any relief of the surrounded Americans. According to official Army records preserved in the National Archives, the relief operation cost over 800 American casualties, while saving only 194 survivors. From the original 600-man battalion, the Lost Battalion incident illustrated both the courage of American soldiers and the terrible cost of the Argonne campaign. Whittlesey's men had fought without food, water, or medical supplies while under constant attack, demonstrating a level of determination that impressed even their German captors when the position was finally relieved. However, the incident also demonstrated the hazards of operating in terrain that favored the defense and the importance of maintaining communication between advancing units. By late October, the character of the fighting had begun to change as German resistance started to show signs of weakness. American forces were encountering more prisoners of war and fewer fanatical defenders, willing to fight to the death. Intelligence reports indicated that German morale was deteriorating under the pressure of continuous American attacks and the knowledge that their homeland was facing revolution and social collapse. Corporal Anderson's squad had been assigned to patrol duties, attempting to locate German positions and assess enemy strength before major assaults. During one such patrol on October 20th, Anderson encountered a German position where the defenders seemed more interested in surrender than resistance. The German soldiers, many of them teenagers or men over 40 years old, appeared to be suffering from malnutrition and had received little recent resupply of ammunition or equipment. Captain Harrison observed similar patterns in his sector. German counterattacks, which had been fierce and well coordinated in September and early October, became increasingly half-hearted and poorly executed. Prisoner interrogations revealed that many German units were operating at less than half strength, and that reinforcements were becoming increasingly scarce. As the German Empire faced military collapse on multiple fronts, the American forces, despite their enormous casualties, were being reinforced and resupplied on a scale that demonstrated the industrial might of the United States. Fresh divisions were arriving at the front while casualties were being replaced, and equipment losses made good by American factories operating at maximum capacity. This industrial advantage was beginning to tell in the tactical balance, as American forces could sustain losses that would have been crippling to their opponents. As October drew to a close, both sides recognized that the Meuse-Argonne offensive had reached a critical juncture. American forces had penetrated deep into German defensive positions, but at an enormous cost. That had tested the limits of American determination. German forces had conducted a masterful defense, but were approaching the point where further resistance would be futile. The stage was set for the final phase of what would become the decisive Battle of the Great War. November 1st, 1918, dawned cold and gray over the Argonne forest, but Captain Harrison sensed a change in the atmosphere. That had nothing to do with the weather. After 5 weeks of grinding combat, the German resistance was finally beginning to crumble. Intelligence reports indicated that several German divisions had been withdrawn from the sector, while those remaining showed signs of severe demoralization and supply shortages. Corporal Anderson led his patrol through terrain that would have been suicidal to traverse just weeks earlier, but now they encountered only token resistance from German positions that had been the scene of fierce fighting. In October, the German defenders seemed more interested in avoiding contact than in mounting serious resistance, and many positions that had cost hundreds of American lives to capture were found abandoned with clear evidence of hasty withdrawal. The transformation was most evident in the changing nature of German prisoners. Early in the offensive, captured Germans had been defiant and well-equipped soldiers who maintained military discipline, even in captivity. By November, American forces were capturing increasing numbers of demoralized troops who seemed relieved to be out of the fighting and spoke openly of their desire for the war to end. Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett, who had replaced the exhausted General Pershing as commander of the American First Army, ordered a final push to break through the remaining German defensive lines and reach the vital Sedan-Mézières Railroad, which supplied German forces throughout the Western Front. This railroad represented Germany's primary logistical lifeline for their positions facing French and British forces, and its capture would make the German position untenable. Captain Harrison's battalion, reinforced with fresh troops and equipment, was assigned a sector that included the village of Grand Pré, which controlled a crucial road junction leading to the railroad. The village had been fortified by German forces over 4 years of occupation and represented one of the strongest defensive positions remaining in American hands. The assault on Grand Pré began on November 1st with an artillery barrage that dwarfed even the opening bombardment of the offensive. American gunners, now experienced in the techniques of forest warfare, delivered precision fire on known German positions. while avoiding the fratricidal incidents that had plagued earlier operations. The coordination between artillery and infantry had improved dramatically since September, reflecting the harsh lessons learned during 5 weeks of combat. Corporal Anderson's squad was among the first to enter the outskirts of Grand Pre, advancing through rubble-strewn streets where every building had been converted into a fortress. However, the expected fierce resistance failed to materialize. Many German positions were found abandoned, with clear evidence that the defenders had withdrawn during the night rather than face another desperate battle. Major Henry Serino's tank units, rebuilt after the devastating losses of September and October, provided crucial support during the advance on Grand Pre. The new tactics developed through bitter experience allowed American tanks to operate effectively in the close terrain of the village, supporting infantry assaults on strong points while avoiding the traps that had destroyed so many armored vehicles. Earlier in the campaign, the capture of Grand Pre on November 2nd marked the effective end of German resistance. In the Argonne sector, American forces had finally achieved the breakthrough that had eluded them. For 5 weeks of continuous fighting, advancing nearly 30 miles through some of the most difficult terrain. On the Western Front, however, the success came at a price that would haunt American military leadership for decades to come. Captain Harrison, surveying the captured village from what had been a German command post, reflected on the transformation of his forces during the campaign. The enthusiastic but inexperienced soldiers who had attacked on September 26th had been replaced by hard-bitten veterans who understood the realities of industrial warfare. These men had learned to fight in small units, to coordinate with supporting arms, and to maintain their effectiveness under conditions that would have broken less determined forces. The human cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive was staggering by any measure. American casualties exceeded 120,000 men killed, wounded, and missing, more than the total casualties suffered by American forces in the Vietnam War. German casualties were proportionally even higher, contributing significantly to the collapse of the German Empire's ability to continue the war. As American forces consolidated their positions around Grand Pre and prepared for what they expected would be continued advance toward the German border, news arrived that would make further fighting unnecessary. German representatives had requested an armistice, and negotiations were already underway in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne. The war that had consumed Europe for years was finally approaching its end. Corporal Anderson, resting in a captured German bunker that had once seemed impregnable, learned of the armistice negotiations with mixed emotions. The prospect of peace was welcome after 5 weeks of continuous combat, but he also felt a deep sadness for the comrades who had died in the final weeks of a war that was now ending. Their sacrifice had contributed to the victory, but at a cost that would be felt by American families for generations to come. The morning of November 11th, 1918, brought an eerie silence to the Argonne forest. Captain Harrison stood in the ruins of Grand Pre, watching as his exhausted soldiers emerged from their positions to witness the end of the Great War. At exactly 11 o'clock, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns fell silent across the Western Front, ending 4 years of industrialized slaughter. Corporal Anderson found himself unable to celebrate despite the knowledge that he had survived the deadliest battle in American military history. Around him lay evidence of the terrible cost of the Meuse-Argonne offensive: shattered forests, where ancient trees had been reduced to splintered stumps, shell-cratered earth that would remain scarred for decades, and hastily marked graves of American soldiers who had fallen in the final weeks of the war. The armistice terms, communicated to forward units through a chain of command that was still recovering from 6 weeks of continuous operations, required German forces to withdraw beyond the Rhine River and surrender massive quantities of military equipment. American forces were ordered to maintain their positions, but to cease all offensive operations, creating a surreal situation where former enemies found themselves occupying positions within sight of each other without exchanging fire. Major Henry Serino, now commanding the remnants of what had once been a full tank brigade, supervised the recovery of American armored vehicles that had been abandoned during the fighting. Many tanks were found to be repairable, but the human cost of the armored operations had been severe. Tank crews had suffered casualty rates exceeding 60%, reflecting the experimental nature of mechanized warfare and the learning curve involved in developing effective tactics. Lieutenant General Hunter Liggett, in his final report on the Meuse-Argonne offensive, would characterize the battle as America's coming of age as a military power. The American expeditionary forces had demonstrated their ability to sustain major combat operations against a determined and experienced enemy, but at a cost that illustrated the brutal realities of modern warfare. American forces had advanced 47 miles through heavily defended terrain, capturing over 16,000 prisoners and 400 artillery pieces, while suffering casualties that exceeded those of many entire wars in American history. Captain Harrison spent the days following the armistice compiling casualty reports and attempting to account for the men under his command. The administrative task of determining who was killed, wounded, missing, or captured proved almost as challenging as the fighting itself, as many units had become scattered during the chaotic forest battles. Some soldiers would remain listed as missing in action for months before their fate could be determined. The aftermath of the Meuse-Argonne offensive revealed the transformation of American military doctrine that had occurred during 6 weeks of combat. Pre-war theories about rapid maneuver and decisive battles had been replaced by a hard-won understanding of attritional warfare, combined arms coordination, and the importance of logistical support for sustained operations. These lessons would influence American military thinking for decades to come. Corporal Anderson was among the soldiers selected for the Army of Occupation, which would remain in Germany to ensure compliance with armistice terms. However, his war had effectively ended. In the Argonne forest, where he had witnessed the courage and sacrifice of ordinary Americans under extraordinary circumstances, the farm boy from Pennsylvania had become a combat veteran whose experiences would shape his understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom. The Meuse-Argonne offensive officially ended with total American casualties of 126,444 men, more than 26,000 killed in action, and over 95,000 wounded. German casualties were estimated at over 100,000, contributing significantly to the military collapse that forced Germany to seek an armistice. The battle had demonstrated American determination and industrial capacity while exacting a price that would be remembered by families across the United States for generations. As winter settled over the Argonne forest, the surviving veterans of the offensive began the process of returning to civilian life or continuing their military service and peacetime duties. The forest itself would bear the scars of the battle for decades: unexploded artillery shells, collapsed bunkers, and mass graves serving as permanent reminders of the 47 days that had decided the fate of the Great War. Captain Harrison, awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for his leadership during the offensive, would remain in the regular army and eventually command a regiment during World War II. His experiences in the Argonne had taught him lessons about leadership, logistics, and the human cost of warfare that would serve him well in future conflicts. However, he would never forget the men who had died under his command in the forests of northeastern France, or the price that America had paid to help end the war to end all wars. The Meuse-Argonne offensive stands as a testament to American military determination and the courage of ordinary citizens transformed into soldiers by the demands of global conflict. It remains the largest and deadliest battle in United States military history, a 47-day crucible that forged the modern American military and demonstrated the nation's willingness to sacrifice for the cause of freedom and democracy.